I'm Elizabeth McDade with the Council, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Practical Ways to Survive and Thrive with Virtual Learning. As you know, many working parents are struggling to balance professional commitments while helping their kids with school at home. So with us today is Ann Dolin, President and Founder of Educational Connections. And Ann is a virtual learning expert, and she's going to share strategies to help you survive and thrive in virtual schooling. We will be recording today's session, and we will have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. We ask that you submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So now I'd like to turn this over to Ann Dolin. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's great to be with you all today. I'm really excited to talk about some practical ways we can all make virtual learning a little bit easier in our families. So let's get started. Here's what we're going to really focus on today. We'll talk about optimizing the workspace to make sure that although our kids have a setup, that where they're working is really the best it can be. Also, along the way, making sure that our kids are focused so that they're able to get the most out of learning. We'll talk about routines, especially that morning routine, getting our kids up and going. And really routines, help to put us all on autopilot. They make our day-to-day lives a little bit easier. Probably most importantly, we'll talk about our relationship with our kids, especially when we're working from home and we're all together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then lastly, how to make that working from home component a little bit less stressful with some visual cues. So Elizabeth and everyone, I'm going to share a lot of strategies today with you. And I hope that you learn from this and can take away some practical ideas for your family. I've also created an ebook with additional tips for you, and you can get it very easily just by texting 55444 and the word virtual. It's called 6 Tips for Smoother at-Home Learning, even when you're dreading it. So let's get started and talk about what we were like back in March. Here was our teacher. She was in front of our kids and she was instructing our students. She could tell when kids were getting it and when they weren't, when they were paying attention and when they weren't. And when she saw that some kids were struggling, she would take maybe 3 or 4 kids and perhaps reteach the concept or help them in a small group. But that's not the way it is now. Here's what it looks like today. There's our teacher in front of this big Zoom room with 25 or 30 kids. And it feels so, is depersonal a word? But it just to our kids feels like there's no human interaction throughout the day like there was in a traditional classroom. And really that is the problem for many of our students. It's not necessarily the platform, it's that kids aren't getting that human touch from their teachers like they used to before. And it's harder for kids. It's definitely harder for teachers, and it's also harder for us as parents. So how do we make it a little bit easier on our end? Well, the first thing we want to do is make sure the setup that we have at home is really the best it can be. There's 2 ways we can go about optimizing the workspace. One is to have an individual desk or table for our kids. It might not be anything fancy like this, but it could be just an old card table you drag up from the basement. But the idea is it's a quiet space for our students. But here's the thing, it can't be too quiet or that can actually be even more distracting for kids. So for example, a mistake I've seen lots of parents make along the way is if their home office is on the 1st floor, they put their kids, maybe their 7-year-old 2nd grader, upstairs in a guest bedroom because it's really quiet for them to do their work. And oftentimes when kids are too isolated, it's actually more distracting. So for elementary school kids in general, they need to be within earshot of us so we can check in just from time to time and make sure they're doing okay. For most kids, the bedroom is not ideal unless you have older kids, maybe in high school, and they've proven to you that they're pretty responsible, they're turning in their work, and they're fairly focused, not a problem. But for most students, even if they have a desk in their room, the bedroom is inherently distracting. And often we see that they're off task more than if they did their work in kind of like a public place within earshot. So here's another option. This is a place, maybe we have a bunch of kids at one desk or a large table, think kitchen table, dining room table, because we have space issues. Or maybe we have kids that are all learning virtually at the same time and they can't have individual workspaces. We can easily divide up space for them at a large table, but there needs to be some type of visual barrier. That you can see the student pages set up on the right. This is just a 3-panel science fair project board her mom got from Michael's craft store for her. And it works great. You know, she needs that visual barrier because when kids are together, they can be just very distracting to one another. Now, if you have this type of setup in your house, also know you're going to need a secondary setup for when kids are talking to their teachers or their peers, because they can just be really distracting to their siblings around them. So really fine-tuning the workspace is where it's at right now. Now, we also want to make sure that our kids are equipped for success with where they sit and also how they manage their time. You know, it could be that having kids sit at a traditional in a traditional chair is not going to work for your student, especially when they're sitting for so long. Some of these kids 7 hours a day. First of all, this is not at all developmentally appropriate for our kids. Virtual learning. We think about a first grader. Their brains are not wired to be able to sit for long periods of time and focus online. It's just not congruent with what they're able to do, with where their brain is. So we need to make it as comfortable for them as possible. It might be, it's a ball chair, especially if you've got a fidgeter in your home. Kids definitely need noise canceling earphones. And to manage time, there's actually research that shows that kids do best with an analog clock and not a digital clock. They can act when they see the hand moving, it helps them understand how much time has passed and about how much time they have left. So if you happen to have an analog clock anywhere in your house, drag it out, put it in your child's study area, and let them use that to track their time. A few other things that can be helpful. You know, it used to be on day one of school, our kids got a planner to write their assignments down. Not so this year. So if your child doesn't have a system for writing things down, make sure they have one. This is just one from Amazon. Older kids often like to have a whiteboard, and I'm a huge fan of whiteboards. This is kind of a fancy one from Pottery Barn, but you can get cheap whiteboards for $5. And the reason that I like them is because kids like them, and kids are generally willing to use a whiteboard. They work well because when kids need to track their assignments, kind of like their little to-do list, if it's in front of them, out in the open, in writing, they're much more likely to get it done because they see it all the time. Similarly, older kids that may not want it out in the open may benefit from an app like Dayboard. I love Dayboard. We have a lot of older kids, high school students using it, middle schoolers too. And Dayboard is basically a Chrome extension whereby every time you open your browser, your to-do list pops up. And what's cool about it is there's also a timer. So let's say you want to study for your upcoming math test for 20 minutes. You set the timer within Dayboard, and there you go. You have 20 minutes to study for your math test. And I like it kind of like the whiteboard because it's always popping up when you're opening your browser window. Some other things that are super helpful. These days, kids don't have a ton of physical papers, but when they do print something out, they need a way to store it, a system to keep organized. You know, trapper keepers were kind of in the 80s. 3-ring binders were in the last 10 or 20 years. But I tell you, the accordion folder is really where it's at for many kids now. I like them because kids can just label the tab with the subject name. And every time they get a paper, they just put it at the back of the section and it's in chronological order. It's also great because you can put larger things. Think a composition book, a workbook, a planner, or even an interactive notebook. All those big bulky things can fit in there too. Some other things that are helpful, especially for little kids, just a Post-it note or a 3x5 card to write down all their usernames and passwords. I love erasable highlighters. I found them super helpful for kids for studying, but not necessarily for reading comprehension. Over the years, I've worked with tons of kids that have become highlighter happy. And when they've printed out something that they have to read, or even when they're reading electronically, or they have a physical book and they're using a highlighter, they tend to highlight as they go. And when they're done with the chapter, the section, the page, they've got a ton of stuff highlighted. Well, here's what research says. It says that actually highlighting is not an effective way to improve your reading comprehension, because as you're reading, you don't know what's important. You only know what's important when you get to the end of the chapter, the end of the page, the end of the section, and ask yourself, what's important here? And then you jot yourself some notes. So highlighters, although they're cool, they're not great for reading comprehension. But what they are great for is studying. So when kids have a quiz or an upcoming test, especially in a language-based subject, they can highlight what they need to know, they can quiz themselves and practice, and when they know it, they can erase it. It's kind of like checking something off from your to-do list. The other product I really like for kids to have are erasable colored pencils for studying and for taking notes, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Okay, so we talked about some supplies. Let's talk about focus. I have a question for you, and I'd love you to put the answer in the chat. Is focus an issue for your child? Is sustaining focus, staying focused? Just say yes, no, or sometimes. Is staying focused an issue for your child? Some days, sometimes, yes. Yes with an exclamation point. Capital yes. All capital letters with 3 exclamation points. All right, so I see a bunch of yeses coming in. And it's not surprising. You know, focus is a real issue for many of our kids, especially in this virtual environment. And, you know, I've seen 3 things in working with lots of kids over the years. I've had a tutoring business for 22 years. And in March, I was really worried when everything went virtually, because my team of tutors have been driving to kids' homes for all these years, sitting next to kids, helping them with their work. And I was really worried, what would this be like over online? And what I found was that actually kids did just fine. You know, when it was this one-to-one environment and they had personal relationships, even kids, many kids that we saw were actually more focused online, because we used all kinds of tools, you know, whiteboard collaboration and different features to keep kids engaged. But what they weren't focused with was when they were in this big Zoom room, in this large group. And that really was the problem, especially when it went on for a long time. And so here are a couple strategies to keep your kids focused when they need to be. And when they need to be isn't all the time, but it is when their teacher is delivering a lesson. So when kids are in a room where their teacher is talking to them and she's sharing information, there's a lecture, there's a PowerPoint, whatever it might be, we want them to be paying attention at those times. And it's interesting, you know, if you have a fidgeter, you probably can identify with this. We see our kids really fidgeting at times of stress. And we'll see them doing things like grabbing things at their table, maybe clicking their mechanical pencil, could be rocking back in their chair, swirling around, you know, playing with their hair, all those things. And as a parent, you know, often our first thing to think about is, oh, will you stop playing with that? If you could just focus, you would learn this so much better. But really, they're fidgeting to stay alert, and their brain needs that sensory stimulation. So instead of saying, stop that, don't touch that, research shows that if we give them some type of fidget tool, they're going to actually be a lot more focused. So here's what those look like. Here's a couple of examples. The top one on the left is actually the best-selling product on Amazon. I wish I invented it. It's so simple. It's a mesh bag with a marble that, as the teacher is talking, kids can have a fidget toy under their desk or on their lap that they can fidget with. We all grew up with Silly Putty. The modern day version is called Neato. Many of our kids have fidget spinners. And for kids that are really wiggly, there's a product called Wiggle Feet sensory cushions for their feet. So all of these are great things to keep kids focused. But sometimes kids also have issues with other parts of other things that go along with focus, like just getting started in the first place. And as definitely as they get older, sustaining their focus for a longer period of time. And that's where timers come in. I'm a huge fan of timers. I'm not sure if you can see the timer in the back here. It's similar to this little red one here at the bottom. It's called a time timer. I've used this product with kids from kindergarten to college, and it's so helpful. So let's say your child's on Instagram and they need to start math homework. Their brain doesn't say, oh, math homework, that's fabulous, let me start that right now. No, their brain says, don't start math homework. Instagram feels so fun. I'm getting this rush. It feels great. It's easy, it's passive. There's not a lot of work to this. Whereas math feels like it's going to be kind of long and hard and daunting. So here's where timers come in. Kids have to trick their brain into thinking that getting started isn't that hard at all, because the brain is going to think it's kind of easy. And the way you do that is starting with super short intervals. You take your child's age and add 1. So your 10-year-old, you set the timer for 11 minutes and you say to your child, look, here's the mantra you're going to use when the timer is ticking. You're going to say to yourself, I'm going to work as hard as I can, focus as best I can, get as much done as I can in that 11 minutes. And then when the timer goes off, I'll take a break, or I can keep on going. Chances are they can keep on going, but they need the timer to get them started. You can also use timers to sustain focus, especially for older kids. This study was done on adults and high school students. It's called the Pomodoro technique. And the researcher was this Italian scientist. And he actually did his research using one of these tomato timers. In Italian, Pomodoro means tomato. He wanted to see what is that sweet spot for people for getting something done. For how long can they sustain the best motivation without losing energy and focus? It turns out that it's 25 minutes. So here's how it can work for you or for your kids. You set the timer for 25 minutes. They repeat the mantra. I'm going to work as hard as I can, as best as I can, get as much done as I can for just 25 minutes, and then I'll take a break. The break is 5 minutes. If they could go it again, they set it again for 25 minutes. We know that the human brain for adults can't sustain more than 4 Pomodoros in a row. So it's Pomodoro, break, Pomodoro, break, Pomodoro, break, Pomodoro. That's a long time. But for kids, it's usually 1 or maybe 2. And then for high schoolers, it may be a little bit more. So we know that focus using timers is really helpful, but we also know from research that actually doodling is a good thing. When I was a teacher, I always had kids in my class that, honestly, I kind of felt that they were disrespectful sometimes because they were huge doodlers. I'd be up in front of the class giving a lesson, and they'd be doodling away at their desk. And I thought they weren't paying attention. So I would say things like, Corinne, look up here. This is really important to know. And she would, and before long, she was back to doodling. Turns out that actually doodlers pay better attention and retain more information than non-doodlers. So here's how this can work for your child during virtual learning. Instead of them, if they have to take notes, just listening to their teacher, they can use this thing called doodle notes. They're kind of like graphic organizers for recording information, and kids love them. On the bottom right, you can see some empty templates and what they look like. So as the teacher is sharing information, instead of just writing on a blank piece of paper, which is honestly hard for kids because their brains think more in sections and compartments, they can record their thoughts into one of these graphic organizers. And what I love about them, you remember those erasable colored pencils I mentioned, kids can make them their own after they've taken their notes. They can color them in. They can add pictures to help them remember. And what is great is when they have to go to study for a test, they're far more likely to pull out their doodle notes because they're interesting and attractive and study from them. And we've found since March, this has been a game changer for our kids. And they really, really love using Doodle Notes, and they're learning a lot more that way too. A few other ideas for focus before kids start in the morning, make sure all their other applications are closed out. They don't need to be running YouTube in the background. That's just inherently distracting. If they have a phone, ideally the phone is in another room when they're doing their work. And if you have a child who's really, you're worried about their media consumption, consider an app like Google Family Link. It really forces parents and kids into discussions about how much media use is okay. They can come together to set limits on certain apps so that kids know what their limits are for certain applications and then for overall usage. But ideally, whenever we make a change, we want to get our kids buy-in. And we don't want to, for example, go to Amazon after this and buy a ton of fidget toys. We want to say to our kids, oh, would this work for you? It might or it might not. Or which two do you like best? Those types of conversations get our kids buy-in. Because ultimately, we want to create a collaboration with our child, and we don't want the relationship to be adversarial at this very difficult time for all of us. And that's really where routines and structure come in. Routines are just things that we do every day so that everybody knows what's coming next. Part of the routine that's often most difficult for kids is that morning routine. You know, getting up on time, getting breakfast on time, being logged in on time. Those seem to be the hardest things for kids right now, partially because many kids are already losing steam. So how do you make that a little bit better in your family? Well, you could come in with kind of being heavy-handed and say, hey, we're doing things differently now, and this is how we're going to do it. Or you could start it with the words, I've noticed. I love the words I've noticed. I found them to be really, really helpful in having conversations with kids because, again, they create collaboration. Instead of, you need to get up on time and you need to be online on time, it helps if you say something like, I've noticed we tend to do better with routines when things are the same from day in and day out. Based on what you know about yourself, about how much time do you think it's going to take you to get ready in the morning? Let's talk about it. What would be a good time to set your alarm? In general, whenever we're talking to our kids and we're having conversations about something that might be tricky, we don't want to ask why questions. Those are really hard for kids. So if we say things about the morning routine, like, why didn't you get up in time? Why aren't you online yet? Why did you get a C on that math test? Why haven't you started that science project yet? It's really hard for kids to formulate an answer right there on the spot. So often it's better if we approach it with more fact-finding, like, oh, what happened when your alarm went off this morning? Or you mentioned you have a science project. What's the first step you might take to get going on that? Those are better conversation starters for our kids than asking the why questions. Ideally, daily, we're touching base with our kids. For older kids, it's usually the night before. We might just check in about the next day. What's their schedule like? You know, what do they have going on? Because the truth is, in the morning, older kids usually will just give us a grunt or a moan. Younger kids, elementary age, are more receptive to conversations in the morning. And we might ask questions like, oh, tell me about your day today. What is your first class? What do you have for your second class? Or even what might you do during your break? Because so many kids have these long breaks. You know, they have sometimes an hour and a half at around lunch. And that break question is helpful because often this is where our kids get stuck. You know, we think, oh, you've been online for 5 hours already. Clearly you want to go out and play. But many of our kids don't. They just want to stay to a screen. They're kind of stuck. But that's not a great time for high dopamine screens, as I'll reference them. So things that are hard, screens that are hard for kids to put down, are things that produce all that dopamine. It's this pleasure chemical in the brain, which we all love. But for kids, it involves video games or YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, things that are really super engaging for kids. And so when we say, all right, put down the video games, it's time for your math class, we get tons of pushback, not because our child doesn't really want to listen to us, but because they have so much dopamine swirling in their brain, it's really just hard for them to do so. So ideally, during breaks, we want our kids to engage in more low dopamine activities. And it could be reading a book online, that's fine. But ideally, it's getting outside. It's riding bikes, maybe playing with friends. It could be arts and crafts for younger kids. It's building with blocks. You know, again, these are fun for kids, but they don't produce all that sensory stimulation, those high dopamine activities. We might also encourage our kids to meet with their friends, to have lunch virtually, to study together after school, in person or virtually. I've seen a lot of kids with mutual interests. We have a student that's really into scrapbooking, and who would have thought kids still scrapbook, but apparently they do. And a couple of nights a week, she'll scrapbook with her friends, you know, from afar, and that's how they stay in touch. So, you know, we want to touch base with our kids once a day, but really more importantly, actually, is once a week. And I like Sunday nights. They set our kids up for success. That's when we might want to talk about the week ahead. So we might want to ask questions like, oh, tell me what you have coming up this week. Do you have any tests or quizzes? Those are all good questions to ask because, again, it helps our kids that tend to procrastinate start to think a little bit ahead. We want to approach our kids when they're at their best. And there are stages of timing for all people, not just kids, but for adults too, where we're going to be in better moods. Now, we all start the day in the morning with a decent level of motivation and energy. But the good news is, as we go along in the morning, it gets better and better. And by around lunchtime, we're at our very best, meaning we have the most energy, we're most focused, and we're most vigilant. For kids, vigilance means the ability to stay focused on something in the face of distractions. So if they're online and their little brother is playing in the room across the way, they're better able to bat away that distraction of their little brother and stay focused at around that time of the day. The bad news is we all kind of have this deep slide, and it's the worst around 3 o'clock, which is often when our kids are done with the day and we're trying to talk to them. So we'll say things like, how was your day? Or do you have homework? And they're not into it. And that's because they're in a trough. Often we're in a trough. We grab a cup of coffee. We have a drop in our performance, our ability to get hard work done, and are focused. Good news is we kind of rebound towards the end of the day, although it's never as good as around lunchtime. So thinking about that, we know when we're at our best and also when our kids are at our best and when it might be best to talk to them. And lastly, we really want to preserve relationships with our kids. This is probably the most important thing we can do at a stressful time. Really put the relationship above grades and all the other things, especially in high pressure areas where we're worried about how our kids are doing academically. We want to dial back our expectations just a little bit and realize this is really tough for our kids, sitting online all day. It's not really developmentally appropriate and it's going to be difficult. So how do we make this all work, especially when we're working from home? We need to have visual reminders for our kids. And that means we want to make sure that they have a printed schedule each day, if that's an option, so that they can see what they have first, second, third. It makes for the day a little bit easier for kids. And for really young students, when you see that they've finished their reading period, have them cross it off or check it off, kind of like a to-do list. Put a big star, a sticker, make a big deal. Awesome job. Wow, you finished your reading period. You know, if it's tough to keep track of kids during the day, You could even assign a go-to person, especially if there's another adult in the house. So you might say, look, Susie and Johnny, I can help you between 9 and 10, but Dad will help you from 10 to 11. If you decide to do kind of like the block and tackle approach, it will need to be in writing for kids. That whiteboard comes in handy right about now, because if we just tell them, it's in one ear and out the other. A visual is almost always better than a verbal. We can also use visuals when we're working from home and we just plain old need to get our work done. So let's say we're on a conference call, we have a deadline, and we really can't be bothered. We can use the red green light approach. That means when we have to get that work done, we'll put a red piece of paper on our door. It could be a red cup at our workstation or a red Sharpie. It doesn't really matter what it is. But the idea is this is a visual to our kids that we need to get work done and we can't help them at that point. Green means, sure, come on in, open door. If you want to get fancy, you could even add yellow. Yellow means knock first before you come in, but really you just need red. You could have red and green, and if you want to get fancy, yellow. If you decide to use a visual like this, you'll need to practice with your kids beforehand. So you'll want to say something like, all right, Jimmy, Susie, come over here. We're going to try this new thing with colors. Now, let's say I have red on my door. That means that I've got to do something really important. I can't help you at that point. So you have to solve the problem on your own. Now, let's say that Susie's talking too loudly and you're getting really upset and you guys start to argue. I have red on my door. What do you do? And role play it. Kids actually love doing that, and it gives them practice for when you implement it. But ultimately, because we want to dial back the stress level in our homes, we want to focus on our kids getting up on time, getting online on time, and getting their work done on time. Really, it's about completion, and it's less about quality at this time. That means we don't have to worry about every word being spelled correctly. If there's enough adjectives in every sentence, or if every last word math problem is correct, those things aren't important right now, especially if we're often in power struggles with our kids. Leave quality to the teacher and focus on completion. And for older kids, use the blind eye strategy, because you may not be able to do much micromanaging because they're older. And you may have to turn a blind eye sometimes. So you might say, listen, Ethan, I'm willing to turn a blind eye to you watching Netflix late at night if you're willing to get up on time and be online on time for your first class. Typically, kids are like, deal. That seems fair to me, and it seems fair to us too. And then lastly, when it comes to relationships, family dinners can also be helpful, but we shouldn't be talking about academics all the time. We wouldn't want to at family dinner say, what'd you get on that spelling test? Or did you start that math assignment yet? Instead, we want the conversations at dinners to be about something non-academic. And the familydinnerproject.org has a whole host of conversation starters to get kids talking. So finally, we want to make sure that our kids are connecting with teachers, that they're asking for help through a private chat, or that they're raising their hand. And if they're embarrassed, that they're able to write an email, which we often have to help them with. But just to have a positive response from an email to their teacher, they're more likely to ask for help again. As parents, we may know that our kids even need additional help if we see that they're struggling with things that may not even be academic, like keeping track of their due dates and staying organized, managing their time. These are called executive functions. Right now, what we're seeing is kids are having the most difficulty with those executive functions, and then also cumulative subjects like math. Because math, for example, is skill-based. One skill builds upon another, whereas something like history or social studies is content-based. If you miss something one day, it's not a big deal. You can reteach it to yourself and you can read it and learn it. But math isn't like that. So if you see that your child's struggling in math, no amount of telling them to focus or work harder is going to help. They may need to see their teacher privately or get somebody else to help re-explain the information. So in closing, when we think about, what are we going to do to make this work for the rest of the year? We want to make sure our space is optimized for our kids, that they're able to focus as they go throughout the day. We want to touch base with them just to check in daily, but really weekly is ideal to talk about the week ahead. And then lastly, we want to preserve relationships, especially if we tend to get in power struggles with our kids, by prioritizing getting the work done and completion over perfection and quality. All right, so I'd love to wrap up and take questions. I wanted to remind you, if you came on a little bit late in the beginning, if you would like an ebook I've put together for you, it's called 6 Tips for Smoother At-Home Learning, even when you're dreading it. You can get it very easily just by texting 55444 and the word virtual, and it will be delivered to your inbox. So Elizabeth, I'd love to take you off mute now, or Julia, even Maureen, and ask if you had questions, or open it up to everybody else for questions. And feel free to put the question in the chat, or if you'd like to use the Q&A feature, you can as well.
So Ann, I don't have little ones at home. I'm fortunate that my children are grown and out of the house right now. But I was, as I'm listening to you, at what point does it make sense for a parent to reach out to the teacher if they see that their child is struggling and they're not sure how to help them? Do you reach out to the teacher, and how do you go about doing that?
I think it's never too early to reach out to the teacher. And I can also tell you, as a teacher, I always appreciated it when parents came to me and told me what was going on at home. Because especially in this situation when teachers cannot see the body language of their students across the internet, they don't always know how they're doing. So reaching out to teachers, and I mentioned using those words, I've noticed, for kids, they work beautifully with teachers. So instead of saying, Jimmy isn't really understanding the math, which can kind of feel like to a teacher that maybe she's not teaching it that well, we could say, oh, I noticed at home Jimmy's struggling with the math. It kind of is a different tone to teachers. It puts it in the conversation in a more collaborative space. So I would tell the teacher what you're observing. I noticed Jimmy seems to have a hard time completing his homework, or I noticed that he's had difficulty paying attention. What do you suggest? Those are all good questions. I'd also ask things like, is the lecture ever recorded? So maybe your child, if they're not understanding, say in math, they can go back and rewatch it. Or are there notes about this that are online that my child could also reference? Those are good questions for a teacher too. And thanks for Elizabeth. All right, so I have one from Barbara, who says, any particular advice when kids are in hybrid mode with some days at school and some days at home? And yes, we're seeing, although most kids where I live in the Washington, D.C. area are virtual, some are hybrid. And what I've seen is the difficulty kids have had in just kind of like keeping up with what is due and what they have to do, because it's almost like when parents are divorced and they're going between houses. It can feel a little bit confusing to them at times, depending on the age. So I think that's where parents can be really involved, and not overly involved, but can check in with them. Oh, tell me what you have going on today, or what are your priorities this evening, especially on days when they've gone to school. And I like that question. It's better than what homework do you have, or do you have homework? Because it gets kids starting to think, okay, what am I going to do first? Or maybe what will I do second? And the priority question, shouldn't expect an answer like, oh, gee, mom, let's see. Well, first I need to finish my geometry, and then I really should do that biology, and I got to start that English essay. You're probably not going to get that from your child if you ask, what are your priorities? But it will help kids to start thinking about what will they do first, second. and maybe third. It helps procrastinators, and it helps kids that are anxious, that think everything's equally a big deal when it's not, about how they might prioritize things. So I'd say just touching base with kids, how are you doing? How are you feeling about things? What are your priorities? Is really key when kids are going back and forth from virtual to hybrid. Thanks for that question, Barbara. All right, let's see. Any other questions that I can answer?
And there's a question in the, I think it might be the chat box.
Oh, okay.
It says, my fourth grader is a high achiever, but even she is struggling to keep up with all the various tools, assignments, etc. Grades are starting to slip despite all her best efforts. Teachers keep saying not to worry, but her self-esteem is running low, seeing poor results. Any suggestions on boosting from a social emotional perspective?
Oh, I can totally understand that. Yeah, that's tough. I used to teach fourth grade, and it's such a transitional year for kids. It really is. Especially if you have a child who really cares and wants to do a good job, and despite their best efforts, they're having a hard time. And so there's a couple of approaches that you can take. One is I would touch base with the teacher and really talk strategies. You don't want the answer, don't worry about it, because that's not completely helpful. You are worried about it, and you want to know, what can you do to better assist your child? Secondly, focus on the things that she's good at, outside of school. If she enjoys doing things, make sure they're part of her life, because grades are not end all be all at this time. But lastly, if you feel that there is an issue with keeping up, and even though she's really dedicated and these things are hard for her, I might even bring more like an executive function coach in from the outside who can teach her some better strategies. So it could be that the way she's done things in person isn't really working for her online, and she may need a better toolbox of strategies. So I would consider maybe like an executive function coach, just to teach her some better strategies so that she's able to help herself a little bit more and feel more in control. Okay, and thank you for that question. So the next one is, my kids are online from 9 to 3, 6 hours and 30 minutes, lunch and only 10-minute breaks, and usually have 1 to 2 hours of homework to be completed online. Ugh. What is the best time to attack the homework, before dinner or after? Oh my gosh, that's so hard. I wish at this time teachers weren't giving that much homework, but that is not the reality. So, I would think back about the stages of timing in the day and think when your kids are most productive. Most kids do, especially at the elementary level, they absolutely need a break after school. And I think sometimes we push kids to get their work done, and they're just not in the mindset, and we might have a better time of it when they're in a better mood later in the evening. So usually what I've found with kids, if they're having a hard time after school, I have them lay out all their stuff they have to do before dinner. Okay, let's create a plan of action. Pull it up on your screen, lay it out on your table. Know exactly what you're going to do. Think about those priorities, what you're going to do first, second, or third. You have a game plan. So after dinner, it's not like, oh, I really don't want to do that, and then you're kind of pulling teeth to get them started. They already have a plan, and they're going to be far more receptive to jumping in and getting it done at that time. So I might experiment with getting it set up before dinner and getting them to do it right after dinner. So I hope that helps, Tony. Thank you for that question. All right, Elizabeth or Julia, do you see anything else? Those are all the questions that I see. Let's see.
I don't see anything. Okay. I think you got them all.
Awesome, great. And I know we're at our time limit, so I wanted to thank everybody so much for participating today. I hope you found this to be helpful, and I wish you the very best for the remainder of the school year. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne. This was lots of great suggestions. Just a reminder, this has been recorded, so it will be up on the council website in the next couple of days. And Ann has all her contact information there, but if you don't have it and you need it, please reach out to Julia or me, and we can help you. Thank you everyone for being with us. I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you again, Ann.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.